The Battle of Naseby, killing a king to build the state. Everything you think you know about how the modern state was born is likely a polite fiction. You imagine a gradual evolution, a slow, reasoned debate in quiet halls of power. That is the myth. The reality is that the modern state, the one you live in, was born in violence, on a field in the English Midlands, and its birth certificate was written in the private ink of a doomed king. On June 14, 1645, the Battle of Naseby broke the back of the Royalist army. That is the simple history. But the real war, the one that would echo for centuries, was 1 hour later, when soldiers broke the lock on the king's personal baggage train. They weren't looking for gold or battle plans. They found something far more dangerous, a collection of private letters. What was in those letters that was so powerful it could not only end a war, but systematically dismantle the divine right of a king? What secret did they contain that would be weaponized to justify a public execution, build a new form of government, and provide the permanent blueprint for the state's power over information itself? This is not the story of a battle. This is the story of how a secret, exposed to the light, became the foundation of the modern world. The machine built to kill an idea. To understand what truly happened at Naseby, you must first erase the romantic image of the English Civil War. Erase the dashing cavalier with his feathered hat and the grim, noble Roundhead. These are caricatures. The conflict was not a clash of styles. It was a clash of systems. On one side stood the last gasp of the medieval world. On the other, the prototype of the modern state. And the new model army was its engine. Before its creation in early 1645, the war had been a bloody, indecisive slog. This was because both sides were, for a time, running on the same outdated software. Armies were raised based on a feudal logic that had governed European warfare for centuries. For King Charles, this meant relying on the commission of array. This was a royal warrant that authorized his loyal aristocrats, the earls and lords, to raise regiments from their own lands. On the surface, this seems logical. But from a systems perspective, it was a catastrophic design flaw. The Royalist army was not a single entity. It was a fragile coalition of private armies. A soldier's loyalty was not to the abstract concept of the crown, but to the man who paid him, housed him, and led him into battle, his local nobleman. This created an organization with dozens of competing centers of gravity. Command was a constant negotiation. Strategy was subject to the pride and whims of powerful men, who saw the war as a stage for personal glory. The perfect embodiment of this systemic weakness was the king's own nephew, Prince Rupert. He was a brilliant and ferocious cavalry commander, perhaps the best of his generation. But his genius was constrained by the very system that empowered him. His cavalry units were notorious for their indiscipline. After a successful charge, they would often abandon the main battle to pursue fleeing enemies or, more disastrously, to plunder the enemy's baggage train. This wasn't a moral failing, it was a structural one. His men were motivated by personal gain and the promise of loot, the primary incentives of the old model of war. Rupert couldn't simply command absolute obedience. He had to manage the expectations of his aristocratic officers and their men. The Royalist war machine was a decentralized, personality-driven network. It could produce moments of incredible battlefield brilliance, but it was brittle, inefficient, and strategically incoherent. Parliament's initial war efforts suffered from the same disease. Its armies were also led by aristocrats, men like the Earl of Essex and the Earl of Manchester, whose political and military ambitions were often at odds. They prosecuted the war with a notable lack of aggression, partly because they still hoped for a negotiated settlement that would preserve the social order and their place within it. They were fighting to restrain the king, not to destroy him. But the war itself was an accelerator. It forced an institutional evolution that would have otherwise taken a century. A radical faction in Parliament, frustrated by the stalemate, engineered a revolution in military affairs. They passed a piece of legislation that was, in itself, a more powerful weapon than any cannon, the self-denying ordinance. This simple act mandated that all members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords resign their military commands. It was a political masterstroke. It severed the link between political status and military authority. It swept away the aristocratic amateurs and their divided loyalties. In their place, a single, professional command structure could be built. This cleared the ground for the creation of the new model army. It was not just a new army, it was a new species of organization. From an institutional engineering perspective, it was a marvel of modern design. First, it was centralized. Sir Thomas Fairfax was appointed its Lord General, its single commander-in-chief. Oliver Cromwell, the only member of Parliament granted an exemption from the ordinance, commanded the cavalry. Orders flowed from a single, unified headquarters. The army could now move and fight as one body with one will. Second, it was meritocratic. The old system of purchasing commissions or gaining command through noble birth was abolished. Officers were chosen for their skill, their experience, and their ideological commitment. This was an asymmetric advantage of immense power. It unlocked a pool of talent that the class-obsessed royalist system could never access. A man could rise from obscurity to command a regiment based on his ability to lead and win. This social mobility created a fiercely loyal and effective officer corps. Third, and most critically, it was a state-funded bureaucracy. The new model army was paid for by Parliament's new, rationalized system of national taxation, the assessment. This provided a regular, reliable stream of funding. For the first time, England had a standing army of professional soldiers who did not have to live off the land or fight for plunder. Their wages were paid, however erratically, by the state. Their iconic red coats, while not yet universal, were a symbol of this new reality. They were not servants of a lord, they were employees of an institution. This seemingly bureaucratic detail was the key to everything. A soldier paid by the state is loyal to the state. This new hardware required new ideological software to run. The new model army was infused with a radical religious purpose. It was a hotbed of Puritan and independent religious thought. Preachers served alongside officers, delivering fiery sermons that framed the war as a holy crusade against a corrupt, crypto-Catholic monarchy. The soldiers of the new model army were not just fighting for Parliament, they were fighting for God. They were not just soldiers, they were armed missionaries. This gave them a cognitive resilience that the royalists could not match. When a royalist regiment was broken, its men might flee. When a new model regiment was broken, its men would often rally, singing psalms, convinced that God was testing their resolve. Their loyalty was not to a person they could see, but to an idea they could believe in. This is the crucial distinction. The royalist soldier fought for his king, a tangible person. The new model soldier fought for a set of abstract concepts, the liberty of the subject, the authority of Parliament, and the establishment of a godly nation. He was loyal to the cause, not the commander. This army was, in essence, an armed bureaucracy in the service of an idea. It was a machine built of men, but designed to be impersonal, efficient, and lethal. It was built to do what the aristocratic commanders of the old armies could never bring themselves to do. It was built to kill a king and the entire political universe he represented. The battle at Naseby would not be a contest of courage. It would be a systems test, and one system was destined for extinction. The engine of war, a balance sheet of blood. Modern warfare is an industrial process. It is a brutal exercise in economics, a contest of supply chains and fiscal endurance. The side with the more resilient economic engine almost always wins. The English Civil War, more than any conflict before it, was a live-fire audit of two competing economic models. If the new model army was the lethal product, then Parliament's financial innovations were the factory that built it. To understand the victory at Naseby, one must first analyze the balance sheets of the two warring corporations, Parliament Incorporated and Monarchy Limited. Parliament began the war with a single, overwhelming strategic asset, the City of London. This was not merely a geographical advantage, it was an economic center of gravity. London was the kingdom's primary port, its banking hub, and its largest commercial center. It contained a concentration of wealth, infrastructure, and administrative talent that was unmatched anywhere else in England. By securing London, Parliament controlled the heart of the English economy and, crucially, the mechanisms for collecting its revenue. They had the institutional hardware necessary to fund a modern war. Their first and most revolutionary innovation was the introduction of the excise. Borrowed from the highly successful Dutch model, the excise was a tax on consumption. It was levied on a wide range of domestically produced goods, most famously beer but also salt, textiles, and other staples. From a systems perspective, this was a stroke of genius. Unlike traditional taxes on land or property, the excise was collected in small increments, at the point of sale, making it both less painful for the individual and far more difficult to evade. It generated a constant, predictable stream of cash, a steady current of revenue flowing into the state's coffers. It was a bureaucratic, impersonal, and highly efficient method of resource extraction, the perfect financial tool for a modernizing state. Building on this foundation, Parliament created its primary engine of war funding, the assessment. This was a direct, monthly tax on property and income, levied on every county under Parliament's control. On the surface, this sounds like any other tax, but its brilliance lay in its administration and its legitimacy. The assessment was not imposed by royal decree, it was passed by a vote in the House of Commons. Local committees, staffed by Parliament-supporting gentry, were responsible for its collection. This created a powerful narrative of consent. This was not a king taking your money. This was you, through your representatives, investing in the defense of your own liberties. It was a tax, but it was also a political participation CACT. This gave Parliament a legitimacy in its fundraising that the king could never hope to match. With these two powerful, scalable revenue streams, Parliament could do something that no English government had ever done before. It could plan. It could budget. It could borrow. The predictable income from the excise and the assessment made Parliament a credit-worthy entity. The powerful merchants and financiers of the City of London were willing to lend vast sums to the parliamentary cause, confident that the loans would be repaid with interest. Parliament was not just raising money, it was building a system of national debt, a core technology of the modern fiscal military state. Their control of the navy and the ports also meant they continued to collect customs duties, strangling the king's access to international trade while keeping their own open. In modern terms, Parliament operated like a well-run corporation with diversified revenue streams, strong cash flow, and access to capital markets. On the other side of the ledger, the king's financial situation was a case study in systemic failure. Charles began the war from his new capital in Oxford, a university town, not a commercial hub. He was cut off from the economic heart of his own kingdom. His methods for funding the war were a desperate, ad hoc collection of medieval expedients. They were decentralized, unsustainable, and ultimately self-defeating. His initial funding came from the personal fortunes of his loyal aristocrats, men like the Earl of Worcester who donated vast sums to the cause. This was the equivalent of a company relying on a few wealthy angel investors. It provides an initial burst of capital, but it is finite. Once that private wealth was spent, it was gone forever. The king then turned to more desperate measures. He famously seized a shipment of bullion stored at the Royal Mint in London before the war began. Later, he compelled the colleges of Oxford University to hand over their centuries-old silver plate, which was melted down into crude coins to pay his troops. These were not the actions of a stable government. They were the actions of an organization in a liquidity crisis, selling off its fixed assets to make payroll. Each act, while providing short-term cash, eroded long-term confidence in his rule. Lacking a bureaucratic mechanism for systematic taxation, the king had to rely on contribution, a euphemism for his armies taking what they needed from the lands they controlled. Royalist soldiers were often unpaid for months at a time and were forced to live off the land, seizing food, supplies, and money from the local population. This was a fiscal and political catastrophe. It created a vicious cycle. The army's plunder alienated the very people the king claimed to be protecting, making them less willing to support his cause and destroying the local economy's ability to produce any surplus. While Parliament could claim it was taxing for liberty, the king's forces were visibly plundering for survival. It was a narrative of chaos versus a narrative of order. The English Civil War was therefore a financial war of attrition. The Royalist economic model was a fragile, decentralized network based on personal loyalty and extraction. It had a high burn rate and constantly shrinking, unpredictable revenue. Parliament's model was a centralized, bureaucratic machine based on institutional legitimacy and systematic taxation. It was scalable, resilient, and sustainable. The new model army was the ultimate expression of this financial superiority. Its soldiers were paid, its armies were supplied, and its campaigns could be sustained over the long term. The battle at Naseby was not an isolated event. It was the inevitable kinetic outcome of a long-term systemic collapse. The king's war machine had run out of money. The parliamentary war machine was just getting started. 3 hours on a June morning. The theories of institutional design and economic resilience are abstract. On the morning of June 14, 1645, on a ridge near the village of Naseby, these theories were about to become brutally, physically real. The battle itself was not a complex affair of grand maneuvers. It was a stark, almost clinical, test of the two systems we have just analyzed. It lasted only 3 hours, but in that short window, the deep structural advantages of the new model army were proven, and the fatal flaws of the royalist system were exposed. The field of Naseby became a laboratory, and the outcome was decisive. The Royalist army, though outnumbered with roughly 9,000 men to Parliament's 14,000, was confident. They were a force of seasoned veterans, and they held what they believed to be the superior ground on Dust Hill. King Charles, observing from a distance, trusted in the shock-and-awe tactics that had served him well in the past, and particularly in the ferocious capabilities of his nephew, Prince Rupert. Rupert commanded the Royalist right wing, a formidable body of cavalry. He was the king's tactical trump card, the embodiment of aristocratic martial prowess. Opposite him on the parliamentary left was a cavalry wing commanded by Henry Ireton, a capable but less experienced officer. On the parliamentary right, commanding the elite cavalry of the Eastern Association, known as the Ironsides, was Oliver Cromwell. In the center, the two masses of infantry faced each other across a shallow valley, a grim wall of pike and musket. The new model army's commander, Sir Thomas Fairfax, took his place among them, a leader sharing the risk, not directing from the rear. The battle began around 10 in the morning, initiated by the Royalists. Prince Rupert, true to form, launched an all-out thunderous charge against Ireton's wing. The kinetic impact was immense. Rupert's cavaliers, driven by personal elan and the promise of glory, crashed into the parliamentary horsemen and shattered them. Ireton himself was wounded, unhorsed, and briefly captured. The parliamentary left flank simply ceased to exist. In the old model of warfare, this would have been the decisive moment, the blow that breaks the enemy's morale and triggers a general rout. And here, the fatal flaw in the royalist operating system revealed itself in spectacular fashion. Having achieved a stunning tactical victory, Rupert and his cavalry did not halt. They did not regroup. They did not turn to attack the now exposed flank of the parliamentary infantry. Instead, driven by the logic of plunder and individual pursuit, they galloped off the battlefield in a chaotic chase after the fleeing enemy, heading straight for the ultimate prize, the parliamentary baggage train. Rupert's charge was a triumph of individual brilliance. Its aftermath was a catastrophic failure of system-level command and control. He had won his battle, but in doing so, had effectively removed his most powerful asset from the wider war. While Rupert was occupied a mile away, a very different drama was unfolding on the other flank. Cromwell, commanding the Ironsides, advanced with a discipline that was almost unnerving. Unlike Rupert's wild charge, Cromwell's cavalry moved at a steady trot, maintaining their formation, firing their pistols at close range, and then crashing into the Royalist left wing commanded by Sir Marmaduke Langdale. The Royalist horsemen, mostly raw recruits from northern England, broke almost immediately under the disciplined pressure. And now came the moment that decided the battle, the moment that proved the superiority of the new system. Having routed his opponents, Cromwell did not allow his men to pursue them off the field. He demonstrated a level of command and control that was simply alien to the Royalist army. He halted his troopers. He regrouped them. He detached a small portion to keep Langdale's men from rallying. And then, with the bulk of his elite cavalry, he performed the single most important action of the battle. He wheeled them around and launched a devastating, perfectly timed charge into the flank and rear of the now unprotected Royalist infantry in the center. The Royalist foot soldiers, locked in a brutal grinding struggle with Fairfax's infantry, had been fighting bravely. The King's personal infantry regiment, the Bluecoats, were veterans who stood their ground with incredible courage. But they were now caught in a trap. They were being pressed from the front by Fairfax's infantry and savaged on their flank by Cromwell's cavalry. The fight became a slaughter. The decentralized Royalist command structure had completely broken down. There was no one to send orders, no strategic reserve to commit. The king himself, seeing the disaster unfold, attempted to lead his personal bodyguard in a desperate final charge, but was physically restrained by a Scottish courtier who rightly saw it as suicide. The collapse was sudden and total. The Royalist infantry began to surrender en masse. What was left of their army dissolved and fled. When Prince Rupert finally managed to disengage his men from their pointless attack on the baggage train and return to the field, the battle was already over. He saw not an army but a rout. The king's cause was not just defeated, it was annihilated. Naseby was a perfect microcosm of the entire war. The Royalist defeat was not due to a lack of courage. It was due to a lack of system. Rupert's charge was the spectacular but unsustainable burst of a decentralized, personality-driven force. Cromwell's maneuver was the cold, calculated, and decisive action of a centralized, disciplined machine. The battle was won not by the side with the more brilliant individual commander, but by the side with the superior organization. The new model army's ability to absorb a devastating blow on one flank, maintain cohesion, and launch a coordinated multi-part counterattack was a direct result of its institutional DNA, its meritocratic officer corps, its disciplined soldiers, and its unified command. In 3 short hours, the medieval model of warfare, based on aristocratic pride and individual glory, was rendered obsolete. The age of the state's professional, bureaucratic killing machine had begun. The king's cabinet opened. The kinetic phase of the battle was over. The screams of the wounded and the grim business of rounding up thousands of prisoners replaced the roar of cannon and musket. For the common soldier of the new model army, this was a moment of exhaustion and relief, the brutal punctuation mark at the end of a terrifying day. But for the course of history, the most significant event of the Battle of Naseby was just beginning. It would not take place on the main battlefield, but a mile away, amidst the chaos of the captured royalist baggage train. The baggage train was the logistical tail of the royalist army, a sprawling, chaotic convoy of wagons, carts, and pack animals carrying everything from gunpowder and food to the personal belongings of the officers. It was a high-value target, which is why Prince Rupert's cavalry had so recklessly charged it. But the train was not undefended. It was guarded by a regiment of blue-coated infantry and a collection of panicked but determined camp followers. They put up a fierce resistance, but they were eventually overwhelmed by the parliamentary forces tasked with securing the rear. Among the captured wagons was the king's personal coach and his private correspondence carriage. This was the mobile administrative heart of the royalist war effort. It contained his state papers, his military plans, and most critically, his personal cabinet. This was not a piece of furniture in the modern sense, but a secure traveling chest, a kind of 17th-century encrypted hard drive, containing the king's most secret and sensitive communications. It was the physical container for the king's strategy, his diplomacy, and his innermost thoughts. We can imagine the scene. A group of grim, mud-spattered parliamentary officers, perhaps led by a commissary general, standing before this ornate wooden chest. The royal cipher, the king's personal brand, is likely emblazoned on its side. The lock is heavy and secure. This is not common plunder. This is something different. An order is given. A crowbar is found or a musket butt is used. There is the splintering of wood, the screech of tortured metal, and then the lid is forced open. What they found inside must have sent a jolt through the men who first saw it. It was not gold or jewels. It was paper. Bundles and bundles of letters, tied neatly with ribbon. Some were originals received by the king. Others were copies of his own outgoing correspondence, meticulously filed by his secretaries. It was a complete, unredacted archive of the king's private dealings for the past several years. In the 17th century, a time before instantaneous communication, the written letter was the primary instrument of power. It was how diplomacy was conducted, how conspiracies were hatched, and how wars were directed. To capture the entire personal correspondence of an enemy head of state was an intelligence coup of unimaginable proportions. It was like gaining the master key to the enemy's entire strategic, political, and psychological operating system. The initial value was obviously military. The letters contained details of royalist troop strengths, strategic intentions, and the names of sympathizers and agents across the country. But as the officers on the scene began to sift through the documents, a dawning, terrifying realization must have set in. The real value of this treasure trove was not military. It was political. It was cognitive. The letters were the raw data of the king's mind. They were his soul on paper, written with the assumption of absolute privacy and security. In them, Charles Stuart was not the carefully curated public figure, the defender of the Protestant faith and the ancient laws of England. He was a desperate political operator, playing a high-stakes game for his own survival. Here was the unvarnished truth, written in his own hand, or the hand of his most trusted secretary, Sir Edward Nicholas. The officers would have found copies of letters to his wife, Queen Henrietta Maria, who was in France seeking aid from Catholic powers. They would have seen his secret negotiations with the Irish Catholic Confederacy, a group England considered to be rebels and heretics. They would have discovered his diplomatic overtures to the Pope and other Catholic monarchs across Europe, pleading for money and foreign soldiers to use against his own subjects. This was the moment of discovery. The physical act of breaking the lock was a symbolic threshold. In that instant, the concept of the king's private political self, the body politic that was supposed to be sacrosanct and mysterious, was shattered. His thoughts were no longer his own. They were now an asset, a weapon in the hands of his mortal enemies. The gravity of this discovery cannot be overstated. It was not just intelligence, it was evidence. It was the complete documentation of a narrative that Parliament had been trying to construct for years. That the king was a tyrant, a liar, and a man willing to sell out his country to foreign, Catholic interests to reclaim his power. The cabinet and its contents were immediately secured and rushed under heavy guard to the headquarters of the parliamentary commanders, Fairfax and Cromwell. From there, it was dispatched to London, to the Committee of Both Kingdoms, the executive body running Parliament's war effort. The journey of this wooden chest from the battlefield of Naseby to the halls of Westminster was the transfer of a weapon of mass destruction. The physical war for England may have been decided in 3 hours of bloody combat, but the information war, the war for the soul of the nation, was about to begin, and Parliament had just acquired the ultimate weapon. The King's cabinet was opened, and with it, a new era of political warfare was unleashed upon the world. War by other means, the first WikiLeaks. When the King's cabinet arrived in London, it presented Parliament with a strategic dilemma. They now possessed incontrovertible proof of the King's duplicity. They could use this intelligence quietly, to inform their own strategy, and to attempt to leverage the King into a more favorable peace settlement. This would have been the conventional move. But the leaders of the Parliamentary War Party, men like Oliver St. John and Henry Martin, understood they were engaged in a new kind of conflict. The war was not just for physical territory, it was for control of the narrative space. It was a battle for the minds of the English people. They made a decision that was, for its time, radical, unprecedented, and utterly devastating. They decided to publish. This was not a simple act of propaganda. It was an act of institutional and cognitive warfare that has few parallels in history until the modern age of mass information leaks. The decision was made to print a selection of the most damning letters in a cheap, mass-market pamphlet. The title they chose was a masterpiece of public relations. The King's Cabinet Opened, or certain packets of secret letters and papers, written with the King's own hand, and taken in his cabinet at Naseby Field. The title itself was a weapon. It was direct, sensational, and promised the reader a forbidden glimpse into the secret heart of power. The pamphlet was printed with astonishing speed and distributed across London and the counties under Parliament's control. It became an instant bestseller. For the first time, the average literate person, the merchant, the lawyer, the skilled artisan, could read the private thoughts of their monarch. It was a revolutionary act of transparency as a weapon. It was the 17th century equivalent of a WikiLeaks data dump, and its impact was just as explosive. What made the contents so catastrophic for the King? It wasn't one single revelation, but a pattern of behavior, a systemic duplicity that destroyed his public persona. The entire royalist cause was built on a carefully constructed narrative. The King presented himself as the defender of the established order, the protector of the Protestant Church of England, the guardian of the ancient laws and constitution of the kingdom, and a reluctant warrior forced to take up arms against a radical Puritan faction. The letters in his cabinet did not just contradict this narrative, they annihilated it. The most damaging revelations centered on religion. In a nation gripped by a deep and visceral fear of Catholicism, popery, the letters provided irrefutable proof that the King was actively negotiating with Catholic powers for military aid. There were letters revealing his secret treaty with the Irish Catholic Confederacy, a group widely seen in England as bloodthirsty rebels responsible for massacring Protestant settlers. The king had promised them religious concessions and political autonomy in exchange for an army of 10,000 Irish Catholic soldiers to be brought over to fight in England. To the average English Protestant, this was not a political maneuver. It was a pact with the devil. It confirmed their worst fears, that the king was willing to unleash a foreign Catholic army on his own people to win the war. Furthermore, the letters exposed his correspondence with his Catholic wife, Queen Henrietta Maria. In them, he promised her that he would suspend the penal laws against Catholics in England as soon as he was able. This was a direct contradiction of his public oaths and pronouncements. It proved that his public defense of the Protestant faith was a lie. The man who claimed to be the head of the Church of England was secretly promising to empower its greatest enemy. From a cognitive warfare perspective, this was a perfect kill shot. It didn't just attack the king's policies, it attacked his very identity. It reframed him in the public mind. He was no longer the legitimate, if misguided, English monarch. He was now a foreign-influenced agent, a man controlled by his French Catholic wife, a conspirator willing to betray the nation's religious identity for personal power. The pamphlet effectively othered the king, casting him as an alien threat to the body politic. The royalists were thrown into a state of panic. Their first instinct was denial. They claimed the letters were forgeries, crude fabrications by the rebels in Parliament. But this claim was unsustainable. Parliament had been strategically brilliant in its presentation. They announced that the original letters were being kept at Guildhall in London, available for public inspection. Anyone who doubted their authenticity could go and see the king's own handwriting and his personal seal. This move preempted any accusations of forgery and amplified the pamphlet's credibility. It was a masterclass in building a verifiable, evidence-based narrative. The publication of The King's Cabinet Opened was an inflection point in the war. It accelerated the collapse of the royalist cause by destroying its moral and political legitimacy. Moderate royalists and those who had been neutral were horrified. How could they continue to fight for a king who was actively trying to bring foreign Catholic armies onto English soil? Support for the king's cause began to hemorrhage. The pamphlet was also a powerful recruiting tool for the new model army, confirming for its soldiers that they were engaged in a righteous, holy war against a treacherous monarch. This was more than just a successful propaganda campaign. It was the birth of a new political technology. It established the principle that a state's legitimacy could be destroyed by the weaponized transparency of its own secret communications. It demonstrated that in a conflict, control over the narrative could be as decisive as control over the battlefield. Parliament had not just defeated the king's army at Naseby. They had captured his story, and they had retold it to the world as a tale of treason. The king could, perhaps, have raised another army, but he could never, ever recover his credibility. The war for England was now effectively over. The war for what England would become had just begun. The death of the body politic. The execution of King Charles I on a cold January morning in 1649 is one of the most jarring moments in Western history. The act itself, the public beheading of a divinely anointed monarch by his own subjects, seems to come out of nowhere. It feels like a rupture in the fabric of reality, a radical and almost unthinkable event. But it was not. The execution was not the cause of a revolution. It was the consequence of one. It was the final, physical confirmation of a death that had already occurred years earlier, on the battlefield of Naseby and in the pages of a pamphlet. To understand the execution, you must see it as the logical endpoint of the processes that Naseby set in motion. For centuries, the concept of monarchy in Europe was built upon a complex legal and theological doctrine known as the king's two bodies. This theory held that the king was composed of two distinct entities. He had a body natural, a physical, mortal human body that could get sick, make mistakes, and would eventually die. But he also possessed a body politic, an immortal, infallible, and divine entity that represented the sovereignty and perpetuity of the kingdom itself. You could attack the king's body natural, as had happened in countless rebellions and assassinations. But the body politic, the asterisk idea of the king, was untouchable. It was a concept ordained by God, and to attack it was to attack God himself. The Battle of Naseby and the publication of the king's cabinet opened, combined to do what was previously thought impossible. They killed the king's body politic. The military defeat was the first blow. The new model army, an instrument of the state, had physically broken the king's army, which was an extension of his personal will. This was a physical demonstration that an institution created by the people's representatives could be more powerful than the personal military force of the monarch. It proved that the king's body natural was vulnerable not just to an assassin's dagger, but to the organized, systematic violence of a state institution. But it was the publication of the king's letters that dealt the truly fatal blow. By exposing the inner thoughts and secret dealings of the monarch, Parliament stripped away the mystery and divinity that shielded the body politic. The letters showed him to be not a semi-divine entity, but a flawed, duplicitous, and desperate man. Charles Stuart, the body natural, was exposed to the world. And in that exposure, the fiction of Charles, the infallible body politic, dissolved. The pamphlet effectively performed a public autopsy on the idea of the king, and the verdict was that it was rotten with deceit. You cannot try and execute a divine concept, but you can absolutely try and execute a man who has been proven to be a liar and a traitor to his own kingdom. Naseby and its aftermath transformed the king from a sacred symbol into a political problem, a problem that could be solved. The years between Naseby in 1645 and the execution in 1649 were a period of intense political struggle, but the trajectory was set. The king, even after his military defeat, refused to accept that the fundamental nature of power had changed. He continued to engage in secret negotiations, playing the army against Parliament, the English against the Scots, hoping to reassemble his power base. But he was no longer negotiating from a position of divine authority. He was a defeated political actor, a prisoner whose only remaining asset was the lingering aura of his former status. The Second English Civil War, a brief and bloody flare-up in 1648, was his final, desperate gamble. When the new model army crushed it, the patience of the army's leaders, particularly Cromwell and Ireton, was exhausted. The king was no longer just a defeated opponent. He was a man of blood, a source of perpetual instability who could not be trusted in any settlement. The decision to put the king on trial was the final, institutional expression of this new reality. The trial itself was a piece of revolutionary political theater. A high court of justice was created by a rump parliament, purged of all members who were unwilling to take this final, radical step. When Charles was brought before this court, he refused to enter a plea. His entire defense rested on a single, powerful argument. The court had no jurisdiction over him. As king, he was the source of all law in the kingdom. How could the law itself put its own source on trial? He was, in essence, making the last stand for the body politic. But his argument was now hollow. The prosecutor, John Cook, laid out the case against him not as a king, but as Charles Stuart, tyrant, traitor, and murderer. The trial was a systematic dismantling of the old order. It was an institution, the court, acting in the name of another institution, Parliament, representing a third abstract entity, the people of England, passing judgment on a person. The charge was, in essence, that the king's body natural had committed treason against the body politic of the nation itself. When the axe fell on January 30th, 1649, it was more than just the end of a man's life. It was the physical severing of the two bodies. The body natural of Charles Stuart was dead, but the more profound event was the public, violent declaration that the body politic of the king was also dead. Sovereignty, that ultimate, indivisible authority to make law and wage war, no longer resided in the person of the monarch. It had been transferred. It now resided in the institution of the state, as represented by Parliament. The execution was the bloody ritual that consecrated this transfer of power. It was the ultimate statement that no person, not even a king, was above the law as defined by the state. The impersonal, bureaucratic, and terrifyingly powerful entity of the modern state had just been born, and its first act was to execute its own creator. The Ghost and the Machine, Naseby's Legacy. History does not end. It echoes. The events at Naseby and the subsequent execution of the king were so traumatic, so radical, that England itself seemed to recoil from them. The monarchy was restored in 1660, and on the surface, it might appear that the old order had returned. But this is a profound misreading of the data. The restored monarchy was a fundamentally different institution from the one that had been destroyed. The ghost of Naseby, the memory of a king defeated and executed by an institution, haunted the subsequent centuries. The principles forged in the fire of the Civil War were not forgotten. They were encoded into the deep political DNA of the Anglo-American world. Naseby was not just an English event. It was a system-level software update, and its code is still running today. The most immediate and tangible legacy was the transformation of the military. The new model army itself became a political problem after the war and was eventually disbanded. But the prototype could not be uninvented. The idea of a permanent, professional, state-funded army, loyal to the government rather than to a person, became the new standard. The fear of a standing army that could be used by a king against his own people became a core tenet of English political thought. When the British Army was formally re-established, it was placed under the strict financial and legal control of Parliament. The annual Mutiny Acts, which had to be passed by Parliament, were a deliberate institutional leash, ensuring that the army could not legally exist without the consent of the people's representatives. This is the bedrock principle of civilian control over the military, a principle that is now the non-negotiable foundation of every stable Western democracy. This critical piece of modern state architecture was designed in direct response to the lessons learned from the new model army. But the deeper legacy lies in the political arguments that Parliament's victory made real. Before the Civil War, the claims of Parliament were just that, claims. They were theories of constitutionalism, arguments for the limitation of royal power. The Battle of Naseby transformed these theories into demonstrated facts. It provided the physical proof, written in blood and iron, that a representative institution could successfully challenge, defeat, and ultimately replace the authority of a monarch. Power, it turned out, did not flow from God to the king. It flowed from the ability to organize, to tax, and to apply violence effectively. This proven concept became the central narrative of the Glorious Revolution of 1688. When King James II, another Stuart monarch with absolutist ambitions and Catholic sympathies, began to overstep his bounds, Parliament did not need to start from scratch. The memory of Naseby was less than 2 generations old. The precedent was there. They knew that a monarch could be deposed. They knew that sovereignty could be redefined. The Glorious Revolution was, in many ways, a bloodless replay of the Civil War's core conflict. Parliament invited a foreign monarch, William of Orange, to invade, and James II, knowing the history of his own father, fled without a major fight. The result was the English Bill of Rights of 1689, a document that formally and permanently established the supremacy of Parliament over the Crown. It outlawed the very abuses that Charles I had been accused of, levying taxes without Parliament's consent, maintaining a standing army in peacetime, and suspending laws. The Bill of Rights was not a new invention. It was the legal codification of the victory that was won at Naseby. This updated political software was not confined to the British Isles. It was exported. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, English colonists in North America were raised on this very political tradition. They saw themselves as Englishmen, entitled to the rights that had been secured by Parliament. They read the same political philosophers, like John Locke, who had justified the Glorious Revolution. When they spoke of the rights of Englishmen, they were speaking of the principles that had been fought for in the Civil War. The American Revolution of 1776 can be seen as the final and most radical application of the Naseby legacy. The colonists' list of grievances against King George III in the Declaration of Independence reads like a direct echo of Parliament's case against Charles I. Taxation without representation was the central cry, the very issue that had sparked the Civil War. The fear of standing armies being quartered among the populace was a direct inheritance of the English fear of royal military power. The American revolutionaries were not inventing a new philosophy of liberty from whole cloth. They were taking the parliamentarian arguments of the 1640s to their logical conclusion. If Parliament could depose a king in the name of the people's rights, why couldn't the people themselves, through their own representative assemblies, dispense with a king altogether? The American Constitution is, in many ways, the ultimate institutional expression of the lessons of Naseby. The separation of powers, the president's role as a civilian commander-in-chief, the absolute control of the legislature over the nation's finances. These are all architectural solutions to the problems posed by an unchecked executive, the very problems that led to the English Civil War. The United States was, in essence, the first nation to be designed from the ground up using the source code that was written and debugged in England during the 1640s and 50s. The ghost in the machine is this simple, terrifying, and profoundly modern idea that the state is an impersonal apparatus of power, and sovereignty resides not in a person but in the institution itself. This idea, which now seems self-evident, was alien to the medieval world. It had to be created. It was designed in the committee rooms of Westminster, funded by the merchants of London, tested on the battlefield of Naseby, and consecrated with a king's blood. Every time a modern legislature votes on a budget, every time a civilian secretary of defense gives an order to a general, every time a citizen claims a right against the power of the state, they are operating within the political and psychological framework that was violently brought into being on a June morning in 1645.